Hello, everybody. This is Brendan Baillod from the Great Lakes Shipwreck Research Group. We're live with a little course that I've been putting together for a while, and I wanted to take this chance to, um, basically broadcast it live so people could watch it. This is a course on kind of an introductory course on the use of side-scan sonar for shipwreck hunting. So I'm going to give it about a minute or two for people to join. So it should be a nice, quick thing that you can do over your lunch. It should be pretty enjoyable. Um, so if you bear with me, we'll get this going. Hello, everybody. It's Brendan Baillod from the Great Lakes Shipwreck Research Group. Welcome to our podcast today. It's going to be the use of side-scan sonar for shipwreck hunting. I'm going to go ahead and get our slide going, and we can start the program. Basically, this is an introductory course for people who are just looking to learn about side-scan sonar. So if you bear with me, we will get it going. All right. So I put together this program a couple of years ago at the request of people who wanted to know more about side-scan sonar, not just as a technology, but what kind of sonar should I get? What's best for what I want to do? What are the issues in using side-scan sonar? It actually is a pretty technical topic. I'm not gonna. You don't even have to go down a rabbit hole to get pretty technical with it. So, I'll give you a little background on it, and then we'll get going. So. Um, Forward my slide here. Here we go. So what is side-scan sonar? I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but beforehand, I'll give you a little bit about my background in side-scan sonar. So first time I ever saw side-scan sonar, I think, in use was probably with Dan Fountain and, the wreck hunter up on Lake Superior. And if you look down at the left-hand part of the screen here, you're going to see an old Lowrance paper Vexilar graph. And what Dan had done is he had taken two of these graphs and essentially put the transducers on a towfish, one pointing each way. And instead of just pointing straight down at the bottom, he had gotten the thing to point out to the side of the towfish. And he was getting pretty reasonably good results, painting a picture of what was out to the sides of the boat instead of what was down below by essentially using two different paper graphs with the transducers aimed sideways. And people have been doing stuff with sonar for years. You can go out on Wikipedia and Google the history of side-scan sonar, or even sonar, and you'll see things about the Navy finding submarines, and about Dr. Harold Edgerton, who I'll talk about a little bit more. But one of the first sonars to come to the Great Lakes was something called an ELAC, and you see it up here on the upper left. This is something that was used by a lot of the wreck hunters, and it basically took a radial transducer and put it down through the hull of the boat, or on the outside of the boat, and it set out a radial ping. And anytime it encountered a variation in the wave that it sent back, it would give you a printout on this oscilloscope here. I actually used one of these years ago with Steve Radovan on the boat, and I got a pretty good idea of how these systems worked in the old days. His was what we called a popcorn popper. You wouldn't watch the screen, you would listen on a headset, and it would make a crackling noise. It would go, and every time there was a large object off to the side, you'd get a loud snap, like a, and that would mean that, the acoustical ping had come back with a delta. It had encountered something, and so, that taught me early on how sonars worked under the hood, without the graphical pictures. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. A few years later, I started working with Harry Zeich, the wreck hunter from Illinois. And Harry had a Klein, an old paper graph Klein, which at that time was about an $80,000 unit, one of the best that you could get on the lakes. And here you see the results from it. The upper right-hand corner is the wreck of the Gallinipper off Sheboygan. And nowadays we get much, much better imagery, but this is what $80,000 bought you in 1998. Down here you see another large wreck target that Harry shot on Lake Huron. He always thought this was the Carruthers. He never did release the location, but he gave me this printout just to tantalize. So, early sonar was sort of an art rather than a science. But as we've gotten into the modern era, sonar has become a lot more advanced. And I'll talk to you a little bit about how it works. What you see here is a traditional Towfish model. You see the Towfish up in the top here. That's an Imagenics, and I'm going to talk about the different brands as we go. And here you can see the tow cable. They're towing the fish, and what the fish is doing is it's putting out an acoustical ping out of each side of the Towfish. You see the little black marks on the side. These are the transducers, and the beam patterns that are shown on the bottom are quite interesting, because you can see what the transducer ping looks like looking from the back of the Towfish. In other words, getting a cross-sectional view of the acoustical ping. They show the main lobe of the ping coming out. What you're going to notice is, and this is an old school sonar where it's got a blank spot underneath. They don't anymore. But the ping shoots upward to the surface of the water as well as downward. And it's not, it's pretty wide. It's a pretty wide cone that's coming out to the side. Also, looking at the lobe from the top can be very instructive. You can see that it's a sharp beam coming out to the side. It also has these feathers coming off of it. Depending on the sonar you have, the beams can be shaped differently, and the shape of the beam has a lot to do with how sharp the image is, not just the frequency, which I will talk about. And knowing that these acoustical pings, don't go out in like a straight line, right? They go out in a feathered lobe pattern like this, is important to know when you're wanting to eliminate anomalies from what you're seeing, which I'll talk about later. So here you see what it looks like. You see the water column, which is this black area in the middle, and down the center is the track line where the Towfish is going. Here we call this the first lobe. This is the bottom lobe, where the acoustical wave contacts the bottom of the water, and then it propagates outward. And what it's doing is it's sending out a pure sine wave, and that sine wave gets distorted by things it encounters on the bottom, and it echoes back. And then this transmitter here, the piezoelectric transmitter, the transducer, not only sends out the sound wave, but it listens for the echo to return. The sound wave it sends out is marked with an alphanumeric time index stamp. And so when it gets an echo back, it knows which ping it's getting the echo back for. And it measures the delta, the distortion, the delta, the difference between the sine wave it sent out and the echo that it got back. And it takes those distortion patterns, and it can either just transduce them into sound, like when you're wearing the headsets and listening to the popcorn popper, or it can, do a radial ping where it shows it on a radial oscilloscope screen like an ELAC, or in the case of modern sonar technology, it shows it over time as the wave propagated out, and it uses a time index to show how far away the distortion was in the wave, and it uses time varied gain to keep the signal strength even as it propagates out. And what you see are some of the distortions in the wave that it picked up. And as the science has gotten more sophisticated, they've been able to take those sound distortions, or those deltas between the pure sine wave and the distorted wave that came back, and make a picture on the screen out of them. Now, depending on how high frequency the wave is, you can get really sharp pictures, because a wave that has many undulations, per second, right, that is higher kilohertz, is going to be able to get finer and finer distortions on the bottom. And a wave that is really long, like a 50 kilohertz wave, won't be able to pick up as fine of distortions on the bottom. So that's how it works. In general, though, when a side scan sonar pings, you see here a time varied graph of the pings: ping 1, ping 2, ping 3. And each ping that goes out propagates out horizontally over the bottom at roughly a right angle. And then the echoes come back. And so the software needs to know, which ping it's listening, it's getting a return for, and it needs to know how to map that onto a coordinate grid system. So what you're going to see here is, successive pings get mapped onto different pixels or different, rows on the screen. And how far away in that ping a distortion gets mapped outward on the grid system. So you've got, essentially two different axes. You've got time, and then you have distance. And the software needs to know how to map that. What you see here on the left is an example of the steamer Uwarda that I mapped at high resolution up in the Keweenaw waterway. It's an iron-hulled steamer, so it shows up pretty strong. You can actually see little pieces of wood inside of the hull that are no bigger around than your arm. This is not necessarily because it was such a high-frequency sonar, but it has a very sharp beam. And I had to go by it very slowly because this vessel is only about 90 feet long. I had it at a very, very short range. This is only 80 feet per channel. And so you can see it fills the whole channel. You have to drive very straight and very slow. And you'll see that sonars can be used for trying to find large objects that are missing and, at low frequency, shoot a very wide swath, or they can be used at very high frequencies to paint pretty pictures of things that you already know are there. So let's talk about the main aspects of what you're seeing on the screen. This is an actual image of when I discovered the tug E.D. Holton up in the Keweenaw waterway. And what you see are the things I showed before. The center line is where the Towfish is, right? The black stuff is the water column. Where it hits the bottom, you can clearly see that, the bottom lobe on the right and on the left. But what's this stuff here, these other lines that we're seeing? Well, what that is the surface lobe. So remember, I showed you that the shape of the beam is not linear, right? It's shaped like a big, cone with feathers. The top of that beam is hitting the water here, is what it's doing. And you're seeing that echoed back. It's echoing back the distortion from the water. And oftentimes, you will see other cloudy things in the water here. That can be distortion from the surface getting reflected back at you. Oftentimes, too, you'll see smoke or mist in the black here. It's not pure black. Why is that? That can be caused by a number of things, and I'll talk about them a little more later. But what you usually see here are changes in the water's density. So any differences in the water's density are going to show up as visual artifacts on the screen, because the sound, as it propagates through the water, is going to propagate either more slowly or more quickly. If it's got to go through water that has variations in density, it will slow that wave down. It'll show up as milky colors or as distortions. And we'll talk about that a little more later. All right. A couple other things to keep in mind. When we tow a towfish, we have a layback. The fish is, unless it's a short cable model, you might have 500 feet of cable out at a real depth. And so it doesn't go in a straight line like this. It goes with a catenary curve, because the force of the water on the cable makes it work in an arch like this. And so calculating exactly how far back the fish is important when you're doing a deep search, because you have to enter it in, because if you run over an object on the bottom and you want to know exactly where it is, you need to know what your layback is. So that's always something that you should enter in and be aware of. All right. So let's talk more about practical matters now. Why do you want a side-scan sonar? There's a lot of different reasons people want a sonar. The most common is probably big game hunting, big ships, big grids, deep water, right? I want to go looking for, the the Henry B. Smith, or I want to go looking for the, the Carruthers or the Paramarquette 18 or Market and Bessemer number 2. You want, or something like that, a long cable model that can go in deep water potentially, but you mostly need something that's going to run at a lower frequency because you need to get out a long distance. You want to shoot maybe a half a mile wide picture of the bottom, or even bigger, right? That's an entirely different sonar than if you want to find smaller broken wrecks doing underwater archaeology. We also sometimes have used our sonar from a raft or a canoe to look in rivers, to map the bottoms of inland lakes, and also for body recovery. Well, that's a whole different use case. That's going to be a high frequency sonar, maybe something that's really small and light. It's not going to necessarily need a real long cable. So those are things to think about, use cases. You generally have a couple of trade-offs with sonar. When we're talking about range versus resolution. If you want to be able to see a half a mile out, you're not going to be able to see small objects. Likewise, if you want to see small objects, you're not going to be able to see out very far. You're going to maybe be able to see out 50 to 100 feet only. So, these fish finder models that people buy that are made for fishermen are usually made to shoot not very far because people want to see fish. Well, to see a fish, you're going to need to be upwards of 600 or 900 or maybe even 1200 kilohertz. But you're not going to be able to go out and take that to find a big shipwreck in deep water. Likewise, if you want to be able to find one of those big wrecks, you need something that's not going to be useful for finding small fish. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. Cost is also a big factor, right? A lot of the long-range units used to cost a whole lot. And even some of the good commercial short range, high resolution units can cost a lot. A couple of factors that affect cost that I'm going to talk about, and the cost has come down dramatically. These companies are still charging an arm and a leg for some of the real high-end sonars, but honestly, bang for the buck, they're almost not worth what they cost anymore. One of the big factors you want to think about is how tightly is your sonar going to be integrated into a laptop or a PC. I personally like software that runs the sonar from a laptop or a PC. To me, that's really, really useful because I can save my files, I can share them. I also like sonars that have software that has a mapping or mosaic functionality. So I can save my tracks and I can put my cursor over an object and it'll give me the GPS coordinates, right? And sometimes you might want all of the above. You might want a sonar that can do everything. And there are sonars that can do everything, but you have to pay for them. So let's talk a little bit more about resolution and range and the different models. There are two different classes of sonars out there. They're what I call professional towfish model sonars, and then fishing or hull-mounted sonars. And there's a lot of overlap between what they can do. At the top end of the professional ones, we've got Klein, EdgeTech, Kongsberg, and to a greater extent these days, Marine Sonic. These are long cable models. What I mean by long cable is they put a preamplifier down in the towfish so that they can have the cable be much longer and go in and get below the thermocline in water, get below surface turbulence, right? And you pay for that. And they also tend to have much better side software that runs on a laptop or runs on a custom laptop formatted box that they give you. And these generally cost a fair amount of money, but they're necessary if you want to do deep water searching. So, the other side is the fishing and hull mounted companies. And you can use these either mounted on the boat or you can build your own towfish and mount them on the towfish to get them below the water. The key difference is that short cable models like this are limited to a cable length of 60 feet. Now, I've heard people say they've bought extensions and made a 90-foot cable, but the signal starts to degrade because there's no preamplifier down in the transducer. And so you lose, and then the difference between 60 feet and 90 feet, in getting the transducer under the water is negligible. The only reason you want to put one of these on a towfish is to get it below the turbulence on the surface and away from the boat. So you don't have crosstalk from other sonars. You don't have a hot channel. If you have a hull mounted transducer, if the boat's leaning to one side, you get one channel that's hot and another one that's not. or you get bad geometry because the transducer is not level front to back. Towfish takes care of that. It automatically corrects that. So for my money, most people are using Garmin's. Why is that? Because Garmin makes a 260 kilohertz transducer. These other companies all make really good fish finders, and they make transducers that do stuff. But the best transducer out there for long-range wreck hunting is the Garmin GT51M, and its predecessor, the CV51M. The reason they're so good is it's not just that they're 260 kilohertz, it's that they have a usable range of 1,250 feet per channel. They're made for commercial fishermen on the East Coast, who go through like schools of fit or looking for shoals of fish. And so they work really well for wreck hunting. Most of the major discoveries on the Great Lakes in the last 10 years have been made with a Garmin GT51M transducer and a 94 SV head. Now, there's some weaknesses and some different difficulties to using that, which I'll talk about, namely that you can record your tracks, but you can't view them again on a Garmin head. It has no way to view things that you've already recorded. Things like Lowrance, Raymarine, Humminbird, these are all useful units, and some of them have decent lower frequency transducers, but nothing that holds a candle to what Garmin had put out with the GT51M. All right, let's talk a little bit more about the big professional quality sonars. You get down here to the bottom, companies like SciQuest, Deep Vision, Tritech, Westmar, and Imagenics play in the lower end of the market. So these guys up here, you're going to pay upwards of $50,000 for their best commercial unit. Down here, you're starting to get under 10,000, and there's a reason for that. They don't have offer the same like armored cable, for example. These guys are up here building things for ocean searching and for deep hostile environments. These guys down here are shallower water units. They may not have as fancy a software. They may not be as modern. They may not plug in with a USB, to your laptop. They may not have mapping ability. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But these are all interesting things. I know people that use almost every one of these different names mentioned here to look for shipwrecks with differing results. So moving right on. How much does a side-scan sonar cost? So I talked about Klein, EdgeTech, Kongsberg, 50,000 up to 200,000 if you want something that's got maybe a sub-bottom profiler or has a magnetometer attached to it, or that that has multiple frequencies on the same fish. In the middle tier, things like Marine Sonic and JW Fishers are still in the $25,000 to $80,000 range. But the low-end professional, Deep Vision in particular, is what I use, and you can get an excellent Deep Vision unit for under $10,000 with long cable and good software. Imagenics I've seen, they're in the same market. I don't find that their imagery is quite as high resolution. I would say the same about Tritech. They play in that same space. You can also find high-end fish finders. Simrad and Furuno in particular make some high-end commercial fish finding sonars that people can use to look for wrecks. But for my money, really the Garmin and the Lowrance fish finders are the most bang for the buck. And then down in the bottom, things like Humminbird makes a perfectly acceptable, wreck hunting fish finder, but they don't have as good of my experience anyway is that their transducer beam isn't quite as sharp as the Garmin or the Lowrance. So the other thing I would mention too is that used units go much cheaper, especially in the professional models. And just a word of advice: I see a lot of people buying these Kleins that are 15 years old. Don't bother buying any of these professional sonars that are more than 10 years old, because you're throwing your money away. The technology has changed so rapidly that a Garmin that you spend $1,000 for will blow any 15-year-old professional sonar out of the water, unless it's got like a magnetometer or a sub-bottom profiler, some special needs you have. But these old sonars that have analog fish, or that hook up to some proprietary box with a tiny little screen on it, just stay away from them. They're not worth it. You can get much better performance out of a Garmin or out of a low-end professional unit that's newer, a Deep Vision and Imagenics. So enough for my soapbox. Let's talk about frequency. Um, One of the things that has a big impact, or that I think people overestimate the impact of sometimes, is the frequency that the sonar runs at. So you have these high frequency sonars that are running at 600, 900, 1200, some even 1800 kilohertz, right? You're going to get really high resolution, but fairly low range. Now, likewise, I talked about low frequency sonars are going to see it a long ways away. Here's the example that they show. 150 kilohertz is showing this anchor and chain over here. Here is what 600 looks like, and you can actually see the shape of the anchor. Whereas on the 150, it's a kind of a grainy looking image, and this 150 is going to be able to shoot a mile wide picture of the bottom, whereas the 600 might get you 900 feet. So I want to talk a little bit too about multi-beam versus multi-frequency sonar, because there's a lot of misunderstandings about that. A multi-beam sonar is a completely different animal. This is a towfish or a boat that has multiple transducers on the hull that are shooting in different, not only in different frequencies, but at different angles. And they're collecting, it's like having multiple sonars running at the same time. They're collecting data from different azimuths. Think of it as a 3D photogrammetry model, but made with sound, with multiple different sonars. And they can take and make a three-dimensional picture of a wreck that you can literally rotate, in 3 dimensions and see. Now, is that useful for finding shipwrecks? I mean, personally, I don't like multi-beam for finding shipwrecks. When NOAA went out and mapped the bottom of Lake Michigan over the last few years, they missed a lot of wrecks because their goal isn't finding shipwrecks. Their goal is mapping the bottom bathymetrically. And so, yes, they get pretty decent detail. It doesn't go real far. It doesn't have the distance propagation that traditional side scan has, nor does it have the clarity that traditional side scan has. And I can show you some examples of that. Now, a multi-frequency towfish is a different thing. Those are really desirable. That's a traditional side scan sonar with a towfish that has transducers that can work at multiple frequencies, depending on how you set them in the software usually. So like Marine Sonic is famous for that. They make a towfish that has a 300, a 600, and a 900 kilohertz setting. Think about how nice that is. You can be down there at the low frequency setting and find a shipwreck, and then without taking the fish out of the water, you can make a 900 kilohertz pass and see it in high detail. That's a really nice thing to have, but you pay for it. Lastly, I'll talk about chirp. You might hear about chirp sonars, compressed high intensity radiated pulse. Here's an example of that. So here we have what it is basically. The traditional sonar is running at a fixed frequency of 200 kilohertz. Here you see, or of however many kilohertz, and the waves are standard here, evenly spaced. On a chirp sonar, they vary the frequency in a longer pulse, so the pulse goes instead of just boom, boom, for lack of a better example. So what you see here is it starts low and goes up high. And what that does is it gives you some of the benefits of the low frequency and that the wave can propagate longer, but it also gives you some of the benefits of higher frequency, that you can get more detail. It also works well for moving things. So most fish finders nowadays use chirp. A lot of the side scans do too, and it gives you more bang for the buck. So, for example, my deep vision little eye is using chirp. So it's not just running at this single low frequency. It's achieving higher resolution because it hits a higher frequency on the top end. So, all right, just some terminology that I want to get out of the way. Why does the frequency of the sonar matter? So this is one of the things that Dr. Harold Edgerton, who was one of the pioneers in Sidescan Sonar, I think discovered, is that there's this sweet spot in frequency of sound where it propagates through water with some interesting properties, and it propagates in such a way that we can take that and use that signal, that echo, to echolocate things on the bottom in high detail. And the magic, sweet spot for those frequencies is about 50 kilohertz up to 1800 kilohertz. 50 kilohertz is pretty low frequency. You get about a half a mile range per channel. People use it for geological mapping. It's really, really long range. A few people on the Great Lakes have 100 kilohertz Kleins. I think Dave Trotter had one, for really looking for big wrecks far away. 150 kilohertz is more common. It's used, again, for large, deep wreck hunting. You're going to certainly get a half a mile per channel in good conditions. 300 kilohertz is a common place that you see. Marine Sonic has a 300 kilohertz fish. 340 is a real sweet spot. A lot of manufacturers make a 340 kilohertz fish. Deep Vision does, for example, and it really has excellent properties. 600 gets common for high resolution mapping, and it's a mid spot for people who want to, do mapping as well as wreck hunting. You start getting upwards to 900 and 1200. These are fish finder resolutions that are looking for, bass. And here's some real examples of high resolution sonars. This is from NOAA. This is a 900 kilohertz showing a barge. And then they stepped that up to 1800 kilohertz here to show the details of the surface. This is a 600 showing a bicycle on the bottom. So these are examples of, what high frequency can do. These really struggle though with when you're pulling a towfish at high frequency. It very often distorts the image because the fish has to fly perfectly straight, the water has to be perfectly still, and the boat has to go really slow. So these were probably shot with a radial sonar, a stationary sonar, maybe even a sonar tower sitting on the bottom of the lake, as opposed to a moving boat. So that should give you some idea of what the different frequencies do. Most fish finders run at 455 kilohertz, and then they go up from there, usually to 1200. Those are not terribly useful for finding shipwrecks. If I was going to mount a transducer from a fish finder on a towfish, I would do a 260. I wouldn't really mount anything else. That's kind of what you want. If you want to do high resolution mapping, it's fine to have the transducer on the boat, really. But I personally prefer to use my Deep Vision little eye for that and to use a towfish model. I want to talk a little bit more about hull-mounted transducers versus towfish-mounted transducers. Part of the problem with hull-mounted transducers, like the one on the bottom here, is they are prone to interference from surface turbulence. You'll get a channel that you can't see very well because, it's mounted with the motor just to the right of the transducer. Unless you mount it way down low on the hull, that motor is going to be in the way probably. The hull strakes cause turbulence, and that's all visible. It all distorts your signal. I mentioned earlier boat lean. You can end up with a hot or cold channel, poor geometry from an uneven plane front to back. And people use the term thermocline a lot. I don't like that term because it's a term that was introduced by scuba divers for that layer of water where it suddenly gets colder. What we really want to talk about in that respect is turbulence in the water. Turbulence is caused by changes, not just changes in temperature, but water motion. And water motion is always caused by changes in temperature. If you ever go out in the desert and you look through a mirage and you see that distortion on the horizon, that's exactly what the water does with temperature. It causes this upwelling. And so the thermoclines are seldom that static. Sometimes there are really strong currents underwater that are caused by thermal movement in the water column, and that really can cause problems for sonar. I'm going to show you some examples of thermocline where the sound wave, the acoustical ping, just cannot penetrate it in a uniform way, and it just keeps you from seeing anything beyond about 300, 400, 500 feet. That particularly happens on warm summer days or where the water has been, where the lake has been rough. And so these hull-mounted transducers have much more difficulty with thermocline because you can't get down below the water. There's also greater potential for damage when you transport the boat. But I mostly mentioned, the cable length dilemma. You can't get beyond 60 feet of cable. You really can't. You're going to find that a lot of manufacturers out there make a short cable towfish, sonar, and they all have 60-foot cables. There's a reason for that. You get much further and you start to degrade the signal. Long cable models, sky's the limit. It just depends on how much of a preamplifier they want to have down there. in the fish, but that costs a lot more money. You can't get into a long cable model very easily for under $10,000. All right. Towfish mounted transducers are really useful because they put physical distance between the transducer and the boat. So that can be really helpful, especially if you're running another fish finder on the boat. I'm going to show you some examples of crosstalk from having multiple sonars running on the boat at the same time. But it also gets it away from the boat's motor and from all that turbulence. They self-level. They can get below thermoclines into colder, stiller water. And it doesn't often take long in the spring. If you can be running 5 to 10 feet down, and it's going to really help a lot. You don't have to get the fish down 50 feet. A lot of us just run the fish only a few feet down, and just to get it away from the boat. And of course, you can adjust the fish depth if you want, but really, I only find that works in shallow water with a short cable model. Now, a homemade fish is quite useful. It turns a low-frequency hull-mounted transducer into a towfish-mounted short cable system. So this is the Rec Sniffer Mark I. This is running at 260 kilohertz. It's got the Garmin GT51M on it. I bought their cable extension kit to make a 60-foot cable, and I can shoot 1,250 feet per channel. You can't really go on much over 400 feet of water really well, because you're eating up 400 feet of that 1,250, right? And then, but I still was seeing the bottom pretty well in 500 feet of water when I was out with Dusty Cliffman, and we imaged these craters in the bottom of the lake pretty well at that time. So I guess I would say 500 feet maybe would be the depth, limit. But again, you got to remember that when you're shooting 1,250 feet per channel in 400 feet of water, the first 400 feet of that gets used up by the water column, right? So that's important to know. Homemade towfish can be difficult. They have to have a weighted nose cone. You have to be careful about where you mount the attachment point so it flies well. And then tail fins are always a problem. I personally like this double cylinder idea that I got from Randy Beebe. Bob Jake manufactured this, and I wired it up. It works really well. Flies really straight. All right. What's the difference between a short cable and a long cable system? Long cable systems are over 60 feet long. They have a preamplifier down in the fish. The problem with a short cable model is you can't fly the fish very deep. So like my deep vision little eye that you see down here will shoot 450 feet per channel. That's it. It's not used for finding big deep wrecks. It's used for taking pretty pictures. And if you're in 200 feet of water, you've only got 250 feet left. The fish is small and it's light, and because of that, it doesn't fly as straight in current. Like, heavy fish fly better. They fly straighter. So something like this that's small and light is best for working under 150 feet of water. It's an excellent choice for underwater archaeology, for hydrographic survey, for seeing what's down there. We just mapped the whole bottom of Eagle Harbor at Ephraim with this unit and got beautiful results. We found every log, rock, and large smallmouth bass because it was just so high resolution. So short cable models can be really excellent, but they have their limitations. I would say they come in two flavors. There's these commercially made short cable models, which are excellent for archaeological survey. They're kind of the sweet spot. And then there are short cable models, that are homemade, like I showed you with the Garmin, that are used for deep water searching, but they've got limitations. Like we can't take that Garmin out in the middle of August because we just won't see through the thermocline, and I'll show you that in a bit. Long cable models are best if you're going to be searching in over 150 feet of water. You have to remember your cable setback, though, which you don't. It's not such an issue with a short cable model. Some cables are armored steel cable. You're going to need that for long cable versus a short nylon cable for these short cable models, which is nice and light. The big thing about the long cable models is they can get really deep below any thermocline and turbulence. And generally, you want to fly these things, roughly a quarter of the way off the bottom. So, if it's 400 feet deep, you're going to want to have this 100 feet off the bottom. for ideal results. That's what they say. Although, you know what? I've gotten good results all over the place. You can use depressor wings if you really want to get to depth. Here's a Klein with a depressor wing. Word to the wise, a human being cannot retrieve a full-size towfish with a depressor wing. You need a winch. They put about 400 pounds of downward thrust on that cable. These long cable models have much more power and range. You know, they have more power because they've got a preamp down there, and they really are putting out a powerful acoustical signal. They're much more expensive, obviously. It's about $10,000 to get into the long cable business with a deep vision deep eye, and they're an excellent unit, but they don't see real far. Deep vision deep eye is going to see maybe, I think it's about 900 feet per channel. So, all right, moving along. Let's talk about what affects seeing, right? So how well you can see. The frequency of the sonar is probably the big one. You need to know what your goal is to choose the right frequency of sonar. You know, are you trying to map things? Do you want to see fine detail? Do you want to make pretty pictures of shipwrecks? Or are you painting the bottom and are you looking for an object that's out there a ways, right? The geometry of the transducer can be an issue. I have tried a lot of different sonars, and I've run over wrecks with them, and I've checked to see, you know, do they have a dead spot on the bottom? Do they see all the way directly underneath the boat? How sharp is their image, right? Different piezoelectric transducers yield different shaped beams. Some are narrow, others are wider. I personally have seen some sonars that I just, you know, that were very expensive that I just didn't like because the beam characteristics weren't very sharp. The big thing, though, is signal processing and screen rendering. More expensive sonars have better signal processing software, and that's all on the board, you know, and in the software. When they take and sample that sound wave, it's sort of like when you digitize music, right? You're turning that sound into you know, data bytes, right? Into you know, bits and bytes. And depending on how fine-grained you do that, and then how fine-grained you map those data bytes onto the pixels of the screen, you're going to get a higher resolution or lower resolution picture. For my money, the best I've seen is deep vision at the low end. Obviously, at the high end, people like Imagenics I'm sorry, not Imagenics, but people like Klein and you know, Edge Tech and Marine Sonic, of course, do a wonderful job. So those are some of the big factors that affect seeing. The others, though, are environmental conditions, and these are what are going to make or break your search or your use of your sonar. I'm going to show you examples of these. I talked about thermocline, which is really temperature and density variations within the water column. It gets worse as it gets warmer, and I would call it really turbulence. But when the water changes temperature abruptly, the sound wave is quite distorted, and oftentimes it'll bounce right off of it. You just won't get any penetration from your acoustical ping from your sonar through that big water density change. Likewise, water turbulence. There are often serious waves on the top. There are subsurface currents, and a lot of times, Bob, Jake, and I have seen, particularly if we're seeing the shape of the bottom and the hard rocky bottom surface makes the water more turbulent, right? Sand or muck bottoms absorb some of that, and you can see much more clearly. Whereas if you're on a rocky bottom or in shallow water where the water moves, you're going to see much more poorly. The wave scatters, and I'll show you what that looks like. It basically looks like lower resolution. Another thing that I've seen really impact things is the turbidity of the water. Suspended solids and microbubbles. If you've had jet skis out on a lake, the water column is going to look white. It'll look like wake, and I'll show you examples of that. The temperature of the water is a big factor. Cold, dense, still water is the best. Being out in early spring is really the best, and in cold weather and where there's not been waves. Cold, dense, still water. Also, shallow water creates challenges. If you're in water under 50 feet deep, the wave movement to the water has an impact, and particularly if it's a rock bottom. And if you get into 10, 15 feet of water and you're using, say, a high frequency sonar to take pretty pictures, you're going to get a lot of scatter because of the shallowness of the water, because you're getting your beam is getting signal from the water's surface as well as from the bottom of the lake. Talked about bottom characteristics a little. Rocky bottoms with a lot of topography cause problems with movement of water. But then again, vegetation and things like that will also distort and obscure. I'll show you some examples. One of the things that few people are aware of that I've had a lot of experience with is EMR or RFI noise. That's electromagnetic radiation or radio frequency interference. The biggest problem I see is dirty power. If you're using a laptop to power your sonar and you're running off of your boat's electrical system, you can really get a lot of inverter noise, and it's going to ruin your day. It looks like lines running on an angle across the screen, uniform lines, and they usually mirror each other on each channel. The way to get by that is to bring your own power source. I use a pure sine wave inverter on an isolated power source, a car battery that I bring, and I run the laptop off of that, or I run right off the laptop's battery. You can also try resistor plugs and things like that on the boat, but I would keep your sonar away from any power sources that are leaking, because you're going to see it on the screen. I've seen FM radio towers nearby also cause radio frequency interference, particularly on short cable models. You can reduce nearby electrical noise with ferrite beads. You can buy them on Amazon. You can go ahead and Google that if you want ferrite bead. You put those around both the power cables and even the sonar tether cable, and you can reduce electrical noise with it to some extent. I would also keep your cable away from motors and electrical sources, but they can leak a signal into cables that are not well shielded and cause distortions. And I'm going to show you examples of this. Also, other sonar acoustics nearby. If you have another fish finder, make sure it's not running close to the frequency of your side scan. We often see sonar signal from fishing boats that are nearby, and it bleeds into our signal. And I'll show you what that looks like too. Especially if you get into shallow water, you might be running two sonars, and they might not have any problem at all when you're in 50 feet of water. But if you get into 15 feet of water, your sonars will start reading each other because they're both bouncing off the bottom, and they're going to start hearing each other, and you're going to see it on your screen. So I'll show you what that looks like too. Other considerations about seeing the speed of your boat. When you go really slow, you're going to get much better data because the ping is going to return more data to you per foot. Archaeological work is best done at 1 to 3 miles an hour and with the wind at your back, because when you're going against the wind, it affects your speed. We just always get better results downwind. Now, we found the Trinidad going 6 miles an hour. When you're searching with low frequency sonar, you can go much faster. I've seen 7 miles an hour. Some people have done. They're even casting a wake. And with like I say, a low frequency unit looking for a big shipwreck, that can work. We did see the Trinidad at 6 miles an hour at 1,250 feet per channel. The depth of the transducer is a consideration. For archaeological work, I fly my little eye only a couple of feet below the surface usually, unless I'm in deeper water. But the deeper the fish, don't forget, the greater distance you can scan. So, if you're in 300 feet of water and you can get your fish down 200 feet, that's 200 more feet of bottom you get to see, right? You're not spending that 200 feet looking through the water column. So long cable models are really useful for these longer searches. Optimal fish depth, though, really depends on your desired scan range and the depth of the water, and to some extent the frequency you're working at. If I've got a long cable model, I generally try to be 3/4 of the way to the bottom. But that can be a double-edged sword. If you're on a bottom that really moves around a lot, and then you're constantly adjusting that fish, I find that it's just not worth it to try to get that close to the bottom. Like, I'll fly the fish 1/3 of the way down sometimes just to avoid nutsing around. Lastly, if you're trying to do archaeological work, you really need to steer straight. And that's important too for long searches, uh, because you got to get your grid straight. You want to have overlap. You want to make sure you parallel your previous path perfectly. So really, being able to steer the boat well is really important for both high frequency archaeological scans and for low frequency rec hunts. Um, One of the things I'd advise people to do is look at the compass. Don't look at the little boat icon on your plotter screen, because the little boat icon might not be answering in real time, but your compass is. And just hold that heading and parallel that previous line. You know, and if you're doing archaeological work, sometimes I'll even put the boat in neutral and just coast past the object instead of you powering past it, because you want to go really slow if you're trying to go do high frequency and low range. All right, things that will ruin your survey. Waves over 2 feet, don't even bother. One of the things you should try to do is run over a known target and see the effect of waves and of different impacts on, or different environmental conditions on your particular sonar. We put some bungee cords and dampeners on our cable now, and it helps a lot. A little bungee cord really helps a lot. But still, if it starts getting rough, you're just not going to be able to see the bottom anymore. You're going to lose contact. If you're trying to do archaeological work, it has to be flat calm. If you're wreck hunting, 2 feet, in my boat is about our maximum. And I mean really 2 feet. You're starting to bounce and get seasick by that point. Bad thermocline or turbulence. If you are on Lake Michigan, the southern part of the lake, and it's after June and you've got a short cable sonar, and you're seeing a whole mess of squiggles and chevrons, all over the place, I would go in. I wouldn't waste your gas money. Also, the real problem is, you're going to think you've covered an area and you really haven't, right? That's a real problem. It's the worst problem you can have. Is you go out there, you spend all this time, you've painted a grid, but you really missed half of it because you couldn't see past 300 feet, and the wreck slipped by on the outside, and then you'll never find it. Having an inexperienced pilot can be a problem. I've had that where people can't steer straight. They don't understand what they're supposed to be doing, how important it is. They don't know how to do an overlap, how to calculate how far over to go next. They have outdated equipment for navigation. I mean, that's really important, big piece of the pie. If you don't have an experienced pilot, or you yourself aren't, you need to get good at it. You need to get good electronic navigation equipment. I mentioned warm, turbulent water. If there's been jet skis or a lot of boats out on a lake, or if there's just been a storm, the water will be unsettled and it's going to show up on the towfish. You can also fly your fish at the wrong depth for conditions. In shallow water, you don't want to go very deep. You won't see very well because you're going to get a bunch of surface reflection and a bunch of beam scatter. In deep water, you don't want to go too shallow, otherwise you'll get surface return. So my rule of thumb is, if you're doing an archaeological scan in shallow water, don't fly the fish deep. Just put it 3 feet down. If you're in deep water, you want to get as deep as you can. So if you've got a short cable model and you're in deep water, put all your cable out, or fly a quarter of the way, 3/4 of the way to the bottom, if you dare. Noisy motor electrical system. If you see a bunch of garbage on your screen, get that fixed. Don't even bother searching with it, because a lot of times you may be able to see stuff on your screen when you're watching it, but when you watch the playback from what was recorded, oftentimes it's just unusable. Be aware of EMR sources nearby, as I said. Also, a real problem that people have is failing to plan a search grid in enough detail. You need to know where you're going to start that search grid and where you're going to end the first line. That's all you need to know, because you can jog over by however much your overlap is going to be and just parallel that other line back and keep doing that over and over again. But you need to know a starting point and an ending point for the first line, and then you need to know what the seeing is like. You can't do that at home. You have to get out on the water, look at how far you're seeing, and then figure out what overlap you need and jog it over from there in real time. That can be hard to do. And lastly, don't hit the bottom or the shipwreck with your towfish. I've done that a dozen times. I've torn the tail fin off. I've torn all sorts of stuff off. It's easier to do than you might think. All right, recommendations for noobs. There is a steep learning curve. There really is. It may, there isn't a steep learning curve just to buy one of these and throw it in the water. Anybody can do that, but to get good at it takes years. Start out with a fish finder side scan and spend a season using it. You know, get out on the water several times in different conditions to see how it affects your sonar. Image known wrecks, and get to know your sonar. Play with its settings to see what its capabilities and limitations are under different conditions. And lastly, go out with an experienced operator and look at other types of sonars and other brands in action. I've been out with probably 24 different wreck hunters over the years, and some of the real kind of pioneers in the field. I've used a Klein, I've used an Imagenics, I've used a Marine Sonic, I've used an Edge Tech, I've used all sorts of different sonars, and I've learned from a lot of people who are really experienced operators. Probably the person I learned the most from is Jim Kennard over on Lake Ontario, just because he really, as an electrical engineer and a person who designed sonars, really understood this technology well. And lastly, don't just rely on pretty pictures from the manufacturer. See the unit in condition in action under adverse conditions, because anybody can take their sonar out in freezing cold water and run it at an ideal depth by a really nice looking wreck with no electrical noise, right? All right, I'm going to show you some examples of what you're going to see with sonar and what good results look like, what bad results look like, and what causes them. This is Eagle Harbor, Michigan with the Deep Vision Little Eye, and you're seeing excellent results here. This is the wreck of the John L. Gross on the left. Up to the right here is the wreck of the Sidewheeler Traveler, and then this was just a broad swath that I shot, not even at full resolution, full distance, but you can see where the channel is dredged here. You can see the land. You can see the edge of the reef. Down here is the wreck of the Napanee. It really, that was cold water early season. And in my sonar Mosaics, the way I do this is I download a BSB file, which is from NOAA for their nautical charts. I load it into the software that the commercial software from Deep Vision, and it'll very accurately map my track lines onto the map to create mosaics. It's really pretty cool. This is Dollar Babe on the Keweenaw Waterway. I was looking for the E.D. Holton, and this will show you a high resolution, just beautiful seeing. You can see the weeds on the side of the lake here. This was early season. It was very cold. It was like a fishbowl in there. You could see every rock and log. There was a big old sawmill. There were a couple of old boats laying around on the bottom. But you get the idea that the mosaicing really gave me some great seeing. This is an example of archeological imaging. And this is an overhead pass on a shipwreck in about 50 feet of water. And you can see every detail. You can see through the window on this vessel. You can see the shape of the hull. You can see that it has a Samson post here. Look at the details of the bottom of the lake. Now, an overhead pass is an interesting technique. If you catch it on the side, it's off on the side. But if you go over it, you can see where the wreck sticks up into the water column and comes up above the bottom lobe, which is quite interesting. You can measure how high the wreck is off the bottom that way. And you can often see a lot of detail. So that's what something looks like on an overhead pass. This is an example of acoustic shadow. This is the wreck of the Sailor Boy in the Keweenaw Waterway. I shot this with the Deep Vision Little Eye. And it's analogous to shining a flashlight, the acoustical ping. It creates a shadow where it can't see what's on the other side of the boat because the sound wave has bounced off effectively. But you get the idea of an acoustical shadow. You can use that shadow to measure how high something is standing in deep water conditions. Here, not so much. But you can see the triple expansion steam engine on this vessel. It's still got a giant propeller. It's really quite intact, and only in about 25 feet of water. Here is deep side signal loss. This is a lost log raft in the Keweenaw Waterway from the 1870s. They had a big log boom coming through. All these logs are approximately 3 to 5 feet in diameter, so I'm on a long range. These are giant logs, but they look like matchsticks. here you see the shoreline, and you see the rocky shore around it as it descends. But why is the left channel so dark? Well, the reason is that I'm shooting downhill. It gets deeper quickly here. I'm shooting uphill to the right, and so it's brighter. And when the beam shoots down a hill like that, it drops out because it's not propagating downward down the bottom. And you can see some debris out here on the bottom. And I had to go out and scan that and overlap that to get that because of the downhill slope. So something to keep in mind. Here is another example of a good archaeological view. This shows the dredging of the Keweenaw Waterway by the Corps of Engineers that you see there. You can see clearly the dredge marks. I see this a lot in harbors around the Great Lakes. You can see some old docks and a barge right here underwater parked up against the shore. Here's the shoreline, and then here is the bottom, and then that's a pretty good sized barge. You don't see its hatches because it's filled with sediment. They had a big runoff event there that covered a lot of these. But again, very high resolution. This is good archaeological quality sonar with very high quality mapping software that renders to the screen. All right, what is this? Everybody who's run a sonar should know what this is. It's crossing a boat's wake. So a boat had come by, and sometimes even 20, 30 minutes earlier, and I crossed it, and you can see the effect of turbulence in the water from that boat's wake on the sound wave. The sound wave propagates at a different rate through that water because that water is disturbed, and it makes it much brighter. What's this little bright spot, you might ask? Well, that's a small school of fish, and they're attracted to the turbulence from the propeller. And so they came up and investigated it. I'll show you more of those later. These are bait fish. This is what they look like in the water column on a high frequency sonar. Again, in the Keweenaw Waterway. We've got a pier here and a log, but bait fish will show up like this out in the water column. They'll show up like this throughout the water column. Anytime you see and they can be pretty tightly clustered balls too, but they generally appear in big schools like that. This is Rock Lake by Lake Mills, Wisconsin, famed for its legendary pyramids, which are really just terminal glacial moraines. I was out there on August 17th. I happen to remember because it was my birthday. And the water column is milky white. And it's because there were all sorts of jet skis out there all day, and it stirred up that water. And here you can see vegetation growing over the pyramid. And there's a rowboat on the bottom right there. I am on a 200 feet per channel, so that's definitely a rowboat. But you get the idea. The beam is scattering. I'm not seeing beyond about maybe 150 feet. And the reason the beam is scattering is because, number one, it's a little shallow, but number two, there's all sorts of suspended oxygen, O2, and also a lot, micro bubbles, and then also a lot of turbulence. All right, this is the Menominee River in Wisconsin, in Milwaukee, and this is an example of crosstalk. So we actually have two sides to the river that have steel revetment. We have this side here, and then this side here. And what you're going to notice is we're getting echoes. This transducer is picking up the ping. The right transducer is picking up the ping from the left transducer after it bounced off the steel revetment. The steel revetment amplified it, sent it back across this side, and we're actually getting multiple echoes from the steel revetment on either side. That's not uncommon. On the bottom, there's a kayak. It is about 16 feet long, and we found a few of those down there. It was very good seeing on the Menominee River that day in Milwaukee. It was very still. But that's a crosstalk echo. You'll see that with big shipwrecks, steel ships. Sometimes they'll talk across both channels. All right, this is thermocline interference. And this is what it really looks like. You're not going to see through it, right? You see all these waves, and it always looks like this. Sometimes it looks, absolutely like shipwrecks too, because you'll be seeing sort of square features, things like this that look like they might be a square feature. But when you see this all over the place, you either have to get your fish lower, and if you can't get your fish lower, it's time to go in because you're wasting your gas. All right. This is interference from turbidity and turbulence. We're off the mouth of Kiwani Harbor. These things should be showing up really clearly. We're on about 300 feet per channel. No, only 150, and the beam is just scattering. Why is that? Well, the Kiwani River had a lot of discharge that day. You could see a lot of surface, flotsam floating on the water. The water was pretty brown. And then also there was a lot of turbulence. The river had current, we had wind and wave, and the beam is just scattering. We were getting almost nothing usable. I mean, we could see things that were maybe 50 feet out. When you got out, further than that, you could see, well, yeah, there's like a piling here or a rock crib or something, but no detail. You compare that to some of these other images that I was getting, here, you can see that, I'm having pretty poor seeing there. All right. Shallow water scattering is another interesting phenomenon. This is the schooner Granger off Shuswap Point up in northern Lake Michigan. Beautiful, beautiful sand ripples. This thing has all sorts of tools and things up in its bow section still. It's an old, three-masted schooner that's largely inundated by sand. But the beam, I had to run right over it to get anything because the beam just scattered. And why is that? Well, it's because it's in 15 feet of water on a sandy bottom. And so you get a lot of water movement. The water is just not still. It's got sand in it, suspended. And we had big waves coming in, just rollers, but it was causing the water column to shift underneath the boat, right? Like if you've ever been scuba diving, you feel your body's moving with the waves. That's what causes this scattering where you start to see all these I can't see beyond about 50 feet on either channel. So I ran right over the Granger to get its picture out. Otherwise, I couldn't get a good picture. Similarly, this is water turbulence off Racine. This is the hull of the schooner H.L. Whitman. And, again, I'm getting very bad shallow water, very bad beam scattering from turbulence. And it's because it was rough. The day before, there had been a storm, and the water was really moving a lot. This is another interesting one. This is the steamer Samoa in Torch Lake on the Keweenaw Peninsula. She's covered by a heavy layer of mud from the copper tailings that they reprocessed and reground and discharged into the lake. This ship burned and sank. It's a 200 and some foot steamship. That's her engine. And she got covered in mud, and it's very hard to image this wreck, even on high resolution, even though the seeing is excellent on the bottom, because she's covered in a very soft layer of mud and sediment. And you'll see that oftentimes. Be aware of that if you're doing shallow searches in lakes. Things don't always jump up and scream at you if they're covered in weed or sediment, or in this case, a soft loam. Inverter noise is shown in this example. This is the rock barge off of Kenosha, Wisconsin. And you can see I'm getting good seeing. I can actually see the boards on the deck here. But what are all these little horizontal lines, that seem to be getting louder as we go outward? That is power inverter noise, not because I had it near an electrical source that was bleeding into the cable. And they get more pronounced as you go out because sonars use time-varied gain. What that means is they turn up the volume, so to speak, on the signal as it propagates away from the boat. Otherwise, it would just get darker and darker and darker until it disappears. So they turn up the gain as it goes out, sort of automatically, to give you a uniform-looking bottom. And that's why noise that's in the signal gets brighter and brighter and more pronounced as you get further out in the signal here, further away from the boat. So that is inverter noise, mild inverter noise. This is serious inverter noise here. This is what happens when you are plugged into a boat battery and your or power noise. Let's put it that way. You're plugged into either a non-pure sine wave inverter, or you're plugged into a power source that's dirty. And this can ruin your search. And you will see this. If you ever see lines like this on any sonar, that's what it is. It's dirty power. So this is an interesting one. This is electromagnetic radiation interference. It's from a fish finder. this is some, I shouldn't say EMR interference. This is actually acoustical interference. This is a fish finder. Somebody else had a fish finder nearby, and when you see these lines like this, that appear as you get further out, and they're kind of jagged. See how they're not uniform? They kind of have little jagged marks in them. That is indicative of interference from another fish finder, and they're always going to be on a gentler angle like that, and sometimes they can be wider. Okay, this is surface distortion from running in waves, rough weather. This is the schooner Kate Kelly out off of Racine, and we're not seeing her very well. And the reason we're not seeing her very well, despite using a pretty good sonar, is that we had 1-footers that they're 2-footers, and it just completely, okay, you can see the waves. That's one thing. The bottom's wavy, but it does something else, and that's that it takes away from the resolution because the ping is getting distorted, micro distortions as well as these macro distortions. So you're just losing the detail. I should be able to count the ribs on the Kate Kelly, but I can't because of the waves. Here's serious wave distortion. This is, I don't even remember what wreck this is, but this is a good example of what they look like when you're in 3-footers. All right. If I was doing Q&A, I would ask everybody to tell me what this is. This is the rock barge off Kenosha. One of the things you can see is there was a fishing boat nearby. I'm getting some distortion or some signal interference from another fish finder. But how come this barge has 2 ends? It's shaped like a Y. What happened here? The only thing we can figure is that the towfish hit a fish in the water, or the cable hit a fish in the water, or hit a log maybe, and the towfish literally inverted. It turned 180 degrees and then snapped back. That's what we think happened there. I can't imagine what else. All right, here's some good seeing examples. This is off Kenosha. We were looking for the western Barkentine, Great West. This is an underwater pipeline from their water intake. And you can just see the beautiful, even the joints on the pipe you can see. And this is 150 feet per channel. Look at the big sand ripples and mud humps. It's just beautiful seeing. We didn't find the ship. The water column, you see how it's nice and dark in the water column. And then there's another little area between the lobes here that looks kind of messy. This is the surface of the lake causing this. This is return from the lake surface, from ripples and waves on the lake surface that causes it to look a little bit cloudier between the lobes. All right. Vegetation. This is an old sawmill. This is vegetation, what it looks like. This is some beautiful examples of what a high frequency sonar can do. We are on 150 feet per channel here, and just seeing beautiful examples of some broken up, a broken barge is what I think it is. It's just demolished. All right, I want to talk about what you can do to look at your fish finder sonar results. So say you've got a Garmin or a Humminbird or one of these other sonars, and you don't have a way to look at it because none of these companies make a viewer, right? There's a product called Sonar TRX. There's another called Reef Master. They're both commercial. And what they do is they allow you to view your sonar files. So you can open up, say, what is it? Is it an RDS file that Garmin makes? And you can open up Sonar TRX, and it'll map that file, that track, onto Google Earth. It's pretty useful. Here's what it looks like. So I've opened my file, my RSD file in Sonar TRX. Actually found a little boat, and you have to look at one channel at a time. So this is the right channel, showing the water column, and I can play it back and look at it, and then I can choose to map it. This is an example of a sonar search we did in the Crawfish River of Aztalan out of a raft with my deep vision little eye, and we mapped all of the fish weir structures on the bottom off of the old Cahokian village, the archaeological site there at Aztalan. And we saw a lot of cool stuff. We saw wall to wall. The seeing was really good. But I used Sonar TRX to map those track lines onto the map, onto Google Earth. So it was pretty cool. So that is really about it. That's all I'm going to cover today. Sidescan sonar, to close, is, can be a really powerful tool, but you need to know what you want to use it for, and you need to choose your tools correctly. I personally own 3 Sidescan sonars, and they all have different purposes. My deep vision little eye is something like I showed you that I use for, to take pretty pictures, and then the wreck sniffer is something that I use to find deep water wrecks. They both work really well for what they do. I didn't pay a lot for either one of them. You can spend a lot of money if you want to, but I haven't found that I needed to, and I get excellent results. I found a lot of stuff. I've taken a lot of pretty pictures without spending more than, I think my little eye cost me something in the neighborhood of $4,000, and my Wreckhunting setup cost me something in the neighborhood of $1,500. Knowing how to use them is a big part of the battle. So I hope you enjoyed this. I know it was a little long, but I've been asked to do this many times to record this class, and I finally have. As far as online resources, there's a lot of stuff online about sonar, but this is a good practical review of real world considerations for looking for shipwrecks, and just how we use the material. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. I want to thank you all for your time. I hope you enjoyed this. I'm going to go ahead and close it down. Again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me, and I will answer your questions as best I can. Thanks again for watching. Have a good day.